Hello, friends. Welcome to 2025. We are still going live on Wednesday nights, and it's a good night to be inside. Hope you're warm, maybe drinking some coffee, some decaf, and settled in for the night. Hi, Helen. It is a very cold time of year. So glad for heat, glad for indoors, and glad for all of you. We're back. We're jumping back into Romans. We've got a tough couple of weeks in Romans, so I was tempted to move on to something else, but we're going to power through. We have been in Romans for over a year, and we're going to finish strong, probably for the rest of this year. Hi, Mom. So, yeah, let's jump into some people who had a not so great start to 2025. We are grateful for Brookridge. We're in our We Are Brookridge series that will be in for the first couple of months. And we are excited to talk about why God put our church into existence and what we want to accomplish this year. So, all exciting things. Reverend Brian Spicer, say very possible Brian Spicer showing in Brookridge in February. We're excited about that. And he, as always, will go live at 7:30 from Bay State's site. So if you want a full hour of Bible study, that's where you head at 7:30. All right. People who are having a bad start to 2025. As you know, whenever you're having a tough day, there's always somebody who's having a tougher day. So, yep, meatballs spilled in the car. At least it smells good. This is a tough one. We see this every once in a while, usually on cakes, where the message that is supposed to be on the cake with the instructions, they just put the whole thing on. So, this was supposed to be this really deep, you are my piece, and give them a puzzle piece. And instead, all the instructions are off there. This is never good when your headboard falls on you while you're asleep. What's funny about this is either they recreated it or somebody came in and took a picture of them before helping them with the headboard. Yeah, this is tough. We have run into this over the years where people have left items in their clothes and then washed them or dried them. In this case, it was a Sharpie. Uh, That's embarrassing. I'm not sure why your underwear was on your balcony in the first place, but it flew off into the neighbor's balcony. So, not a great day. Oh, man. Look at this. This is one of those impossible puzzles where it's very difficult, all the same color. You get it together, and then you can't find that last piece. Very challenging. And when you're warming up your soup and you fall asleep, and now it's just a brick of burnness. This is tough. You want to make a good impression, your new job location, and you blow up the mixer. Not great. Oh, this is tough. You spend hours on the cake and then you drop it. I don't know if that's going out the door or coming in, but either way, that is a tragedy. When you leave some sort of carbonated beverage in your car during winter, not good. These are not the times of year to leave things you care about in your car. I thought it was just oh, there. It's maggots, I think. It's yeah. No, I can't. Whatever that is, don't eat it. Here's another one. Happy anniversary and red heart. I'm pretty sure they were just supposed to put a red heart underneath it, but they wrote it out. Yeah, pizza. One of the most delicious things you can eat. Also, one of the least nutritious things you can eat. But maybe with a cockroach on there, you get a little protein. No, I wouldn't eat that. That's not the most attractive bath bomb. Here, let's not be these people. Here's the deal. People who follow Jesus should be the best tippers. That is all I have to say about that. I'm supposed to keep score. No one told me the game is canceled. That is No good. Somebody's helping you out by keeping the score in a game you don't tell them. This is supposed to be an onion bagel, and it just has 2 tiny little pieces of onion. Sad. $100 bottle of scotch, now worth not $100. Bit into something hard in my spinach. First of all, why are you eating spinach? That was your first problem. Second problem is there was something gross in there. We've seen a lot of spillage over the years. People having a tough day when they spill something. That was a 3-pound bag of peas. Peas was spelled incorrectly. For those of you who noticed, I did notice that. Again, you think you find a $100 bill? Nope. Hey, you've annoyed your neighbors if this happens to your Christmas lights. That was a pretty sharp cut. I guess that could have been an animal, but it kind of looks like a person. I don't know if we've talked about this or not, but I believe in New England or New Hampshire, it's called Julie's Law, I believe. Or if you leave snow and ice on top of your car because it can fly off and injure somebody else, it's actually against the law to drive around like this. This is ridiculous. But there are a lot of people who don't clean their cars off. Very annoying. Also annoying when a bat flies into you and then falls into your breakfast. That's rough. Rough day. Yeah, accidentally left my phone in the fridge. There's leaving your phone in your fridge and there's putting your phone in the fridge in the first place. And that looks more like a freezer effect. Yeah, I'm pretty sure your freezer is broken. That is not what it's supposed to look like in the inside. Oh, this is tough. A lot of people now, a trendy thing to do is to put an air tag in your luggage or in your bag or both so you can track where it is. This is not good when you are back in Florida and your backpack is still on the West Coast. Not great. Not great. There is a box of thumbtacks on the carpet and they couldn't find all of them. That is very tough. If you look very closely, you can see some. That is just an accident waiting to happen. Dropped an entire jar of glitter. It's a very bad day. This is great. There's these stairs and there's a sign that says, please don't fall down the steps. Guess what happened after I read that sign? We can all guess what happened. Since I think there's something wrong with my toaster, I don't know. There could be something wrong with the toaster. Could be the user error. Tough to tell. 6 feet of snow and 100 feet of driveway equals one fun day. That does not look like a fun day. Hopefully they had a snowblower. Even then, probably a lot. I accidentally washed a loaf of bread with my lunch. How in the world does that happen? I don't know. Listen, after squeezing all the liquid out of the butter, I realized the stone on my ring is, who needs to squeeze the liquid out of their... All right. If I'm ever eating with any of you, I do not need your hands to have squeezed the liquid out of the butter. Leave the liquid in there. Oh, we've seen these before. AC fails. Pushed it right out the window. The tough one. This is tough when somebody locks their bike to yours and then it's raining. Not getting that one. This is tough. Didn't realize the paint was wet. Then you tripped. There is a lot going on there. Very sad. This is tough. We've seen a lot of things that in tubes or packages that look like each other, you definitely would want to make sure you took the correct thing here. And it seems like whoever was posting this did not take the correct thing. Sad. Very sad. All right. So hopefully you feel better about your lives now. And we are going to look at Romans 11 soon. Okay. I like that. Romans 11. All right. Here's the deal with Romans 11. Very, very difficult chapter. the idea, the overarching idea of Romans 11 is Paul is answering the question, will God forsake his people? So think about that. But got a bunch of confusing stuff in it. It talks a lot about who the true Israel is, how God's grafting Gentiles in their place, like a wild branch onto an olive tree. And a lot of times we can read Romans 11 and just not be sure at all how or where it applies to us. There are a lot of pastors, when they're speaking through Romans, that skip chapters 9 through 11. So you go right from Romans 8, who could separate us from the love of God, to Romans 12, which is a huge, another huge chapter that we get to go over in about a month. This one guy said they were working their way through Romans at his church. And when they got to chapter 11, the pastor stood up and said, listen, I'm just not sure what's going on in Romans 11. And I'm having a hard time seeing how it's relevant to us or edifying for us. Plus, our VBS and our student camp weeks are coming up. So let's spend the morning praying about those, and we'll pick up with Romans 12 next week. I guess he was brave enough to say he didn't really know what was going on in Romans 11. Some scholars even say that chapters 9 through 11 function like a historical footnote that Paul puts in just for the Jews, but it's mostly irrelevant for the rest of us. They say the gospel logic of Romans jumps from the end of Romans 8 to the beginning of Romans 12, and you can skip 9 through 11 without losing the progression. But I disagree. I mean, we've gone through chapters 9 and 10. When we started chapter 9, Paul recognizes the question that the thinking person is asking when he gets into all the promises of Romans 8. Who can separate us from the love of God? All those God foreknew, he predestined, and those he predestined, he justified. And all along, we went over that in Romans chapter 9. But the thinking person would ask, so by the way, I am not better than any other pastors. I just listen to some pastors that have done a good job going through Romans, and they have put out some good notes, and then I match some things together, and we go through it on Wednesday nights. So that's it. I'm not saying I'm better than the rest of them. I just have really good notes. The thinking person asks, hey, who can separate us from the love of God? God foreknew and predestined what was happening. And so you could say, hey, what about the Jews? Weren't they also God's chosen people? They've fallen away from the love of God. They rejected Jesus. So how was this not a failure on God's part? And this is where it gets important for us. If God failed with the Jews, how can we be sure he won't fail with us also? And the premise of this is the promises in the Old Testament. They read like they're unconditional. Genesis 12, God promised Abraham to bless his descendants with salvation, make them a blessing to the world. And that promise reads as unconditional. And then after making the promise, we've talked about this before, there was a ceremony called passing through the pieces. So God sealed his promise in Genesis 15 with this covenant ceremony where he makes Abraham cut 3 animals in half, place them on either side of a ditch so their blood forms a river. Sounds really gross, but it was a common ceremony at that time. And what the idea was, if I failed to keep my end of the bargain, may my blood flow like this. May I be cut asunder like this. But then God didn't let Abraham go through the middle of the pieces. God went through by himself, saying, if I fail to keep up my end of the bargain, let this happen to me. If you fail to keep up your end of the bargain, let this happen to me, which was a whole revolutionary way of doing this covenant ceremony. So the question is, if God reneged on those unconditional promises to Israel, how do we know he won't do the same with us? And so this is Paul in chapter 11, still wrestling with this question. So here's what we're going to lay out over the next 4 weeks. In the first 16 verses, he answers this question. Like, what did God really go back on his word? Then he gives us an important warning that flows out of his answer. And that's what we're going to cover next week. And then the last 9 verses of the chapter, he bursts into an explosion of praise, reflecting on the answer. So we'll look at the question, then the warning, then the praise. So tonight is the question. So this is verses 1 through 16 of Romans chapter 11. He offers 5 answers to prove that God has not reneged on his Genesis 12 promises. So the first, we'll call it the Paul argument. So Paul says, I am a Jew. I'm an Israelite. So he says, has God rejected his people? By no means. So absolutely not. And then he says, I myself am an Israelite, so I'm a Jew. And then he says, a descendant of Abraham, member of the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul's like, listen, I'm a Jew. In fact, all of the apostles are Jews. And not only has he saved us, but he's using us mightily. So that's the Paul argument. God keeps his word. The second one, the election argument. So Paul says, God has not rejected his people. This is verse 2. So God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Since, like I explained to you in chapter 9, since the very beginning, we see that not every son of Abraham truly belonged to God. He used two examples in Romans 9. I know you remember this all from when we went over it, but Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac was the son of promise. Ishmael was not. Then Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob embraced the promise of God. Esau rejected it. Those represent, Paul said, two kinds of Israelites in Israel, those who know God and those who don't. The true Israelites that God foreknew are not those who inherit the biological DNA of Abraham, but those who embrace Abraham's faith. So he concludes here in verse 2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. The Jacobs and the Isaacs, who he had an actual relationship with, he didn't cast off. The ones who God foreknew, who showed by embracing the promises of God personally for themselves that they still belong to God. All right, third, he gives the Elijah argument. So verses 2 through 4. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? What was God's answer to him in verse 4? So if you remember the story of Elijah, he was an Old Testament prophet. He found himself on a mountaintop complaining to God that nobody was left in all of Israel who trusted God beside him. It was like, poor me, I'm the only one that's still serving you, God. And God responded, as Paul is quoting here, I have left or kept 7,000 for myself who have not bowed down to Baal. So basically, Elijah, you're not alone. There's still a remnant of people who are faithful to me. And in the same way, Paul's saying God has preserved a remnant of his people. Like, so sure, you may look at the Jewish nation as a whole, even now, and say they've rejected God. But if you look closer, you'll see that God has preserved a remnant who still belong to him. This has always been true. Not only was the early church birthed by Jews, throughout history, there's always been a small but thriving Jewish Christian community. If I could just throw this in, just when you think it's over, like Elijah, standing on top of a mountain thinking the chapter is closed, you find out that God's been doing something you didn't know about, raising up help from another place. Think about this. Think about the early church. If you'd been around in the first century, who would have thought within a couple hundred years that the Roman Empire, the pagan, brutal, sexually lascivious Roman Empire, would become the seat of Christianity? Nobody would have thought that. If you had lived in the 4th century, would you ever have thought the center of Christianity would shift to the English-speaking world? Because at the time, they were a bunch of barbarians and savage tribesmen. And could you ever have predicted that when European Christianity went liberal and secular and shifted, that a little upstart country called the United States, which at the time of Paul didn't even exist yet, on a continent they didn't even know about, that would become the most massive mission-sending country in history? Today, the church is growing fastest in some of China, Latin America, Africa, and countries we thought were completely closed to the gospel at one point. Some of the most dangerous parts of the world. Who could have predicted that? Just when you think things are over, you find out God's been doing something you didn't know about. It's like a friend of mine says, if you're not dead, God's not done. So Paul says, hey, for those 3 reasons, I say God hasn't totally forsaken his people. And then in verse 11, so he does some quoting here from the Old Testament, and then he goes to verse 11 where he starts talking about the Gentiles being grafted in. So Paul, remember that Romans is Paul hearing people asking questions and proactively answering those questions. So he's hearing in his head somebody saying, that's it? That's the fulfillment of all these promises? All we should expect is a small Jewish Christian community? I sure thought Israel as a whole was going to respond to God. that the Jewish people would be known as his people. And it looks like God wasn't able to pull that off. And now the Gentiles were kind of like his consolation prize, where the Gentiles, like God's safety school. When you apply to a school that you can get into, if you don't get into the one you want to go to, did God really want the Jews but couldn't get them? So he settled for the Gentiles. So in verse 11, Paul gives his fourth answer. This is the future argument. He explains that Israel's response to the gospel is going to unfold in three major stages. It's pretty cool because it shows you what to expect from ethnic Jews in the future. Stage one, Israel's mostly negative response to the gospel opened the door for Gentiles to hear and believe. That was the first stage. In verse 11, he said, by their transgression or by their trespasses, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Remember, the gospel originally went to the Jews, and then in the book of Acts started spreading out to the non-Jews, the Gentiles. The fact that Israel missed it opened up a unique opportunity for Gentiles to believe. I'm glad because I'm here today because of that. In the book of Acts, the gospel spread into new cities, followed a very predictable pattern. So the apostles would first preach in the local Jewish synagogue. The Jewish reaction there would be mixed, with a few believing, most rejecting. So they'd kick him out. Remember, that happened to Paul a lot. He'd start at the synagogue, get kicked out of there, and then just start speaking in the street, and people would come to know Jesus. So the rejection from the synagogue would drive the apostles out to preach in the public areas of the city, the streets and the marketplaces, where they'd find a bunch of Gentiles willing to believe. And within 100 years, Christianity becomes this thriving, multi-ethnic movement comprised primarily of Gentiles. Imagine, though, that if in every town, just the whole synagogue had been converted. The apostles may have grown complacent, may have never gotten out into the city, and Christianity could have easily remained just a Jewish thing. This brings us to stage two. Gentile believers, so Paul says, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. What does that mean? By their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel jealous. This is not a bad, sinful jealousy. Think about it like this. Imagine one's teenage kids leave the house. And so the parents begin to take in homeless and foster children. And on Christmas morning, the biological kids are cold and lonely, and they come back and look through the windows of the house, and they see all these other children sitting around the Christmas tree with all these presents, and they say, I could have had that. I miss the relationships that I had and all the blessing that it brings. That's what was happening now with the Jews. There's a sense in which many Jews resent the closeness that Gentiles feel toward their God, the God of the Old Testament, the God of their forefathers, which will eventually lead to stage three. At some point in the future, Israel as a nation will come back to God, leading to a worldwide gospel movement. Gentile love of the gospel will eventually cause Israel as a nation to turn back to God. And I'll jump down to verse 25 so you can see that. It says, lest you be wise, or a potential hardening, lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. All right. What does this mean? After this Gentile wave is over, there will become a time where all Israel will be saved. By saying all Israel, it doesn't mean that every single Jewish person alive becomes a Christian, just that there will come a time that there'll be such a massive movement to the gospel that we will think of it almost as a national conversion. And this national conversion will in turn spawn a worldwide movement of the gospel. This is a hugely encouraging verse. Verse 12 said, now if their transgression brings riches for the world and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fullness bring? So if their rejection of the gospel brought Gentiles to Jesus, Paul's saying one day if they embrace the God of the gospel and the gospel itself, how much fullness will that bring to the world? He's like, God promised that Israel will be a blessing to the nations, and they have been. Even their rejection of Jesus gave the Gentiles an opportunity to know the gospel. So if their rejection of God blessed the Gentiles, imagine what their embrace of him will cause. So, in other words, if even their disobedience brought blessing, how much more will their obedience bring blessing? So Paul doesn't go into a lot of detail about how this massive Jewish return to Christ will lead to a worldwide movement. Revelation says in the latter days of what some Christians will call the tribulation, God saves 144,000 Jewish people and appoints them as his worldwide witnesses, who in turn lead a substantial part of the world population to belief in Jesus. Many scholars say that points to this national return of Israel. Whatever it looks like, this will happen, Paul is saying, because God will indeed fulfill his promises to the Jews, just like he said. So even though right now Israel on a whole has rejected God, they are still loved, Paul will say later in this chapter, because of the promises to the patriarchs, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, since God's gracious gifts and calling are irrevocable. So to sum this up, has God failed to keep his promise to make Israel a blessing to the nations? Not at all. Many Jewish people have been saved, and even their rejection has led to Gentile salvation. But the best is yet to come. Now, I just want to point out one more thing that we can learn from Paul in all this. Never, ever give up on the people in your lives. Even after facing rejection after rejection from the Jewish people, Paul never gives up hope that his Israelite friends can be saved. We didn't cover this passage in chapter 9, but the beginning of chapter 9 says, I'm speaking the truth in Christ. I'm not lying. My conscience bears me witness in the Holy Spirit. This is unusual for Paul. He says, I'm speaking the truth of Christ. I'm not lying. My conscience bears me witness. He says, I'm not exaggerating. Usually when he's speaking, he's like, of course I'm telling the truth. I'm not Apostle Paul. Be quiet. But here he goes to great lengths to let you know he's not exaggerating or being poetic. He says in verse 2 that I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh. In other words, like Moses said, remember when Moses was pleading on behalf of Israel before God, he actually offered himself in their place. And Paul is saying, I would rather be accursed and cut off from Christ if my Jewish brothers and sisters could be saved. That's quite the burden. Is there anybody or any group that you feel like that about? Perhaps your kids? Like, think about if one of them walked away from God, how that would make you feel. Great sorrow, unceasing anguish in my heart. Sometimes I think we don't have enough sorrow and unceasing anguish in our hearts for those people who don't know Jesus. John Knox, who saw a massive gospel awakening happen in Scotland in the 16th century, was known to pray, God, give me Scotland or I die. And people close to him say that he meant it. Many missionaries that you run into today feel like that about the people that they've gone to give their lives for. Some of you will develop that burden for your friends and your family. Who is your one? Who is your many? Don't give up on them. God put them on your heart for a reason. So that anguish and that sorrow, it comes from a divine place. And Paul says they are loved because of the promises God gave to you, just like Israel. And I'll remind you of a promise in Psalm 126, those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. Those who go forth in weeping will doubtless come again, bringing the harvest with them. So Paul is trying to explain some theology, but then he always comes back to everyone needs to hear the gospel. He gave his life for people to hear the gospel and to understand who Jesus did, what he did, and the opportunity of hope and salvation and forgiveness and life change and eternal life and everything that comes along with having a relationship with God. So think about the people who don't have what you have. We pray for them. We don't stop praying. And we look for opportunities to live out the gospel. And if necessary, use words to speak the gospel to them. All right, that's the first part of Romans 11. So again, The question was, has God failed to keep his promise? The answer is absolutely not. So we know that God will also keep his promises to us. And that is super, super encouraging. Hey, Claire's here. Hi, Claire. Reverend Jim Warnock. Nice to see you, my friend. All right. So hopefully this was encouraging for you. I know a lot of you are jumping over to Bay State. My buddy Brian Spicer. For the rest of you, I hope you have a really good rest of your week. For those of you who are tracking with Brookridge, really, really important message this week. We're talking about the dream, the what do we see for the future of Brookridge? What does God have for us in 2025 and beyond? And we're excited to share that this Sunday. So we'll see you at 10 a.m. on Sunday. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will see you soon.